Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Empyrion Galactic Survival episode 162. I'm Enigmaeus and today we're continuing with our Copperhead hover vessel build. The last episode we started working on the exterior hull detailing. We put in sort of the ribbed area back here along the central dorsal region of the ship. I finished that off a little bit. I brought it out a little bit farther to the side along one of the ridges that we had. And then I started messing around with the feature that I kind of decided to build this whole ship just so that I could mess around with it. And this is the woven sort of texture that I was looking at in the Heracles that we set up. We used it a little bit on the Heracles, but I really wanted a build where it had an opportunity to be a little more center stage. As you can see, we're going around here and we're looking at this kind of area in here around this ridge, and the same thing over here. And as you go around and you look at it from different angles, it shifts because different edges are exposed. So it has that sort of shifting, undulating effect as you go around that I find is really, really neat. It reminds me of carbon fiber and just sort of a woven effect in general, which is why I started calling it hull weave in my tiny little mind. I really like it. And the nice thing about it is that you can experiment with it, you can use different patterns, you can come up with different things that you want to do, and then it just looks really, really cool. And at first glance, it's really difficult to figure out what the hell might be causing that effect as you're moving around the ship, but it's really simple and straightforward to put together. So what I decided to do is use some visual aids. We're going to go look at those, and then we're going to switch over to the time-lapse kind of thing, and we're going to finish putting this stuff all the way down the top of the ship and get the bulk of that taken care of. This whole thing is based on two specific blocks. We've got the wall block here. This is the full-sized square that's very thin, and it's of course uniform all the way across. And then we have the slope block that we use as part of the 22.5 degree sort of set that wound up being 3 pieces to make a convex curve. Not complicated, not difficult to use in most cases. And the key feature with this block is that this edge here matches up with this one here, or this face, I guess you could say, the little skinny face, seamlessly. So it lets you come up with certain patterns, and it's got that very, very subtle transitioning effect of the slope to the flat, to the slope to the flat. And if we put them together in a specific pattern, in this case, a square here, and then a slope attached to one side and then this slope attached to the other, and sort of like a V-shaped scenario, and then we put them together and we start repeating that pattern over and over, and then we scoot over to the side and we continue repeating the pattern over and over. What we end up with once we get it painted is the surface is set up one way, the edges are set up another, and we've got that sort of shifting little subtle edge reveal, so that as we go around it does that sort of thing where it disappears and reappears, and something that wasn't there is suddenly there, and the one that was there is suddenly gone. Really simple and straightforward. But one of the things that I would really encourage you to do, if you're not feeling absolutely confident going into this, you want to give it a try, but you're not 100% clear on what you want to do, give yourself space to set up something like this. Do it where you can use big blocks. Easy to paint, easy to texture, easy to move around. It doesn't take a lot of time and effort to make changes, as opposed to trying to build it on the ship where you're matching contours and going around different bends in the hull and all that other stuff. Make it easy on yourself. Kind of set up something like this, because then once you do, you understand the pattern that you're trying to duplicate. It's basically like a diagonal here, and then it steps up a little bit. It's a little bit offset. It's not another 45 degree transition across that way. It's kind of like that. But then it continues off on that angle. It's kind of like a herringbone pattern. If you're familiar with tiling or bricklaying, it's not quite a herringbone pattern, but very, very close, at least in concept. What you can do once you've got this laid out is you can take a look at strips, and you look for patterns there. And once you've discovered the pattern that exists in a straight strip, you can use that as a tool for starting to lay out wherever you want. Whatever ship you want to use, wherever it happens to be, however much space you have to work with. If you've got a long, thin line that you can start laying out with, you can use the pattern that you gleaned from this to get yourself started. And in this case, the pattern is very simple. It's the flat square to the slope down to the side, and then slope back towards you. If you want it a different way, you can do it this way. Slope down to the side and then sloping away. or sloping away and then sloping down to the side. Whatever angle you want to approach it from, whichever way you want to describe it, it's up to you. But then you can find that pattern, and let's just for the sake of argument, we'll go with this one. It's flat, slopes down to the side, and then slopes away. We come up here. This would be the flat square here. Again, like I say, it's almost impossible to tell because of the way the seams come together. This is your square, slopes down to the side, slopes away. Square, down to the side, away. Square, down to the side, away. All the way down. Once you've got that in place, and you know from there, everything just sort of repeats this 3-block pattern off at a 45-degree angle, your layout is done. And then you can look at something like this. This is our square with our V shape here. There's a square going off that way. You can't put one of the blocks in here because this one's in the way, so you don't worry about it. You go to the next one, and you're basically starting from this square, working that 45-degree angle out this way with squares, then with slopes, then with other slopes. Makes it so much easier. And then again, in order to illustrate that this isn't by any stretch of the imagination the only option, and nor is this, I just wanted to show you, you can mess around with other patterns. You can come up with different things that aren't necessarily as simple as this, where it's just the same 3 blocks repeating over and over, but still not especially complicated once you kind of take a moment to look at it, lay it out, play around with it, find where things repeat, and then roll with those once you've got everything laid out the way that you want them to, and use that to get it onto your ship. We've got the flat wall block, uniform thickness, and then the 4 slopes kind of connecting to it, all sloping away. So kind of like a plus shaped pattern is what I'll call it, or flower shape, whatever you want to call it. The same 2 blocks, and we're using one of those blocks in 4 different directions. Then we come over here and we do the exact same thing. And you can see we've got the blue, the medium blue here is a flat square block that's got the sloped blocks with the light blue here connected to it. So that's why you can't see the faces on this flat square. In order to make this pattern work, I found it was easier to put a square in each of the corners here. Once you've got this in place, you've got this plus shape pattern, you're going to have the 4 corners are open. Take another square block, put it in each of the 4 corners, and then you can see you're going to have these edges exposed, which is a good thing because that's what this is all about. It's all about the exposed edges and the shifting when you're moving around. Then you start duplicating the pattern again. There's the plus shape, and then we would put the square in the 4 corners. Another plus shape, square in 4 corners. You can see the way I've painted. Hopefully it makes a little bit more sense how everything comes together. Square with slopes attached, square in between in the 4 corners, and then you just duplicate that all the way around, alternating rows. So what we're going to do now is we're going to switch over to the time-lapse view. We're going to try and get the rest of the top of the ship finished with this sort of woven texture, and we'll go from there. Just a couple of things before we get head first into all of this. I went back between the end of the last segment and the beginning of this one and reworked the back end of the ship down the middle on the top, just so that we'd have more flat sections to put the woven steel / scales. Otherwise, it was looking to me like it would be a little bit too inconsistent. We had too many sections where I wasn't able to place them, and I wanted to have a little bit more coverage. So if you're looking at it and wondering why it looks a little bit different and it's not making sense to you, it's because it is actually structurally different than it was before. The other thing that I wanted to point out, as you can see, we're working with mirror mode, and we've got the mirror plane right down the middle of this area where we're working. As a result, setting up the profiles and orienting them properly was a little bit more difficult than I expected, because this middle row is very, very different. The pattern that we came up with is only suited to going in one direction. It's not suited to being split in the middle and going to either direction. So it took a little while to kind of sort out a solution that I would be happy with. And a part of that end result is that the pattern isn't oriented the same on the top part of the ship as it will be on the sides of the ship once we get done this top section and start working on the ridges. So that's something to keep in mind. I've tried to edit out as much duplication in this process as I could, just for the interest of saving time, so that we didn't have to speed things up to the point where things were ludicrous and very difficult to follow without cheating you guys out of things that might be useful to see. But at the same time, we're already pushing the limits of what I would consider an acceptable length for the video. So if you're finding it a little bit long, it's not expected to be a normal thing that the videos are this long, but it was sort of trying to get everything done that I wanted to get done in this episode and making a balance between the two. And the last thing that I want to point out before we get down to the specifics, if you look at my hotbar, you'll see I've got 2 cubes of hardened steel. And this was a tip that was passed along by a couple of different viewers who pointed out you can put multiple stacks of materials on your hotbar, and then you go to each stack and select a block shape with that stack, go down the line, select a different block shape with each of those stacks, and then when you want to change shape as you're building, you just switch to a different stack in your hotbar, and it's a big time saver. In this case, we're using 2 very specific blocks over and over and over again to create this woven effect, and for that reason it made a great deal of sense that I use this method. Not only is it more elegant and time saving than selecting from a block menu every time you want to switch, it's also a big time saver in editing for me, not having to remove all of those block selection menus. When it comes to a more general sort of building scenario for me, I find quite often that there are so many different blocks I use, it's not really practical to have them on my hotbar. But it really is a good tip, and if you hadn't heard it before, I thought I'd pass it along to you guys so that you can try it and see if it improves things in your situation. Now, if you look at these scaled sections and look at all those little edges, all those little orange edges that we've just put in place, and we've textured them and we've painted them, and if you can imagine having to go through individually and texture and paint each of those edges, I would lose my mind. Especially when you're doing a section like the top section down the middle, and you know you still have a lot more to do that you haven't even built yet. It would be kind of a soul-sucking proposition. But in this case, because we came up with some tricks that we talked about in the last episode to make the whole process much, much easier, especially when it comes to doing the fine detailing work, it was such a treat. It's so much easier to get things done, and then you just move on to the next segment. This part here, as you can see, it looks a little bit chaotic how things are going into place. The one thing that I'll point out is that the orientation of this pattern, the direction that it's facing, so to speak, will be the same on these lower ridges as they are on the very top ridge that we kind of set up already as the test pattern. You can see in the very top section of the screen there. That having been said, I'm not really too concerned with making sure that each ridge lines up with the one above it or below it. So it may be a little bit different from one to the other. As long as they're facing in the same direction, however, it's not that big of a deal. But what this means is, because I've now had enough experience with this pattern and how it sort of repeats and kind of little tricks to use to place it without necessarily having a point of reference all the time, I'm basically selecting one block, and in the case of the slopes, a particular orientation of that block, and placing it down in a bunch of different places, and then switch to the next one and carry on. What ended up happening is that I got it right, which is unheard of. Something like this, to get it right and not have to go back and rework it significantly because of big mistakes that you made. You put one block in the wrong spot and use that as a point of reference for a bunch of other things that you added, and you realize the first block was wrong. That happens to me all the time. This went together very, very quickly and easily, and the end result was a tremendous feeling of satisfaction when you place that last block and you realize you got it right all the way through, and it didn't feel like a chore. It didn't feel like we were fastidiously running back and forth, counting blocks and making sure that we've got everything just right every step of the way, because we're working with a pattern, and as long as we understand that pattern, we can sort of work around areas like ledges where we can't place blocks. And in the end, it made this whole process much, much quicker and easier than it could have been. That having been said, there's a decision to be made, and I've already made it. But if you're using this method in your own builds, one thing to consider is whether you want to have the kind of rough edges, the look that it has now, where we're using just the squares, and how they come up against angled areas, we just kind of leave it. And the benefit of doing it that way is that it will preserve the profiles, the exposed profiles, those orange little edges that help define the pattern when you're looking at it once everything is done. Those will be more uniform throughout because they're all on display. If you were instead to go and fill in all of those little angled sections along the edges, you lose some of those little profile exposures, so it doesn't quite have that same uniformity across the whole layer, but you get a cleaner looking edge. And in this case, like I say, you see that very top section popping into view in the top of the screen from time to time. I've already made that decision and I'm going for the cleaner edge, but it's something that you may want to spend a little bit of time and decide for yourself. Set it up, get all of the squares in place, and then maybe leave it for a little while with the edges rough and unfinished. And if you decide that it's really not working for you, then it's not going to take you any longer to come back and add them later than it would if you had added them at the very beginning of the process. So it's just something to keep in mind as you proceed through the whole shenanigan, as they say. The other thing that I wanted to point out, and this is fairly significant when it comes to saving time and understanding what's going on, when it comes to filling in those little 45-degree areas like you see directly in front of us now, those little edges, that specific wall block, the 45-degree angle, works on both sides of the mirror. So you can use that with mirror mode on and it'll work just fine. You'll go to the other side and it'll be lined up the way you want it to. When it comes to the 22.5-degree angles, however, it doesn't work in mirror mode. You'll place it on one side, you'll go to the other side, there'll be a block there, and it'll be the completely wrong orientation. And the reason is because the block that you use on this side to fill in that specific edge is not the same block that you use on the other side, and the mirror mode can't account for that. It can't change to a different block in order to create that mirrored profile on the other side. So it'll be wrong every time. Now, I don't know if there are plans to change it. I'm not intending this to be a complaint about something. It's just pointing out that if you're working with these specific kinds of blocks, it's probably easier to turn off mirror mode, do everything on one side, go over, do everything on the other side. The alternative is if you leave mirror mode on, you do everything on one side, when you go to the other side, you have to remove everything that was placed incorrectly before you can finish it off anyway. So you're just saving the time of having to remove it if you turn off mirror mode before you go and do the other side. Pretty simple and straightforward, one way or the other. But it was something that I found was a little bit tricky. The other thing to keep in mind is when it comes to painting and texturing in mirror mode, we touched on this previously and how some blocks, the faces kind of wrap a little bit funky, and if you paint or texture something, one of those kinds of blocks on one side, it doesn't always work on the other side, but it's fairly simple and straightforward fix. In this particular case, if you paint and texture everything in mirror mode for the whole block, if you have your paint and texture gun set to work on the entire block, it'll work on either side regardless of what block that you're using. It doesn't care if it's the same block, it just goes by the block space, and it's a pretty reliable thing to do. If you're painting or texturing just a single face on a block, that's when you have to be wary of things working on one side but not converting properly over to the other side. It's an easy fix. It's always an easy fix. It's not something to be too worried about, but it is something to be aware of going forward to save yourself a little bit of time and maybe a little bit of embarrassment if the paint job on one side doesn't look the same as the other and you neglected to check. So here we are. We're in the final stages. We're painting the entire block glossy, texturing the entire block glossy, painting the entire block orange, texturing the top surface with the flat, and then painting it flat black, and then it's job done. Very simple, straightforward. There's still obviously a certain amount left to be done. We haven't really done a whole lot on the inside. Now that the exterior is mostly done, I feel a lot more comfortable going onto the inside and trying to get everything set up and taken care of, smoothed off, roughed out a little bit more so that the hull is a little bit thicker where it needs to be a little bit thicker, and then start thinking about where we're going to start placing all of the equipment and things that we need on the interior. We've got the underside of the ship to take a look at. There's probably going to be some refinements and improvements and adjustments on the top side of the ship as well as time goes on. But when it comes to small vessels and hover vessels, I found by the time you get the top part of the hull, the main part of the hull that you see from the outside done, everything else comes together very, very quickly. So there will be a blueprint for this guy coming in the not horribly distant future. If you want to be notified about future videos finishing the exterior of the ship, the interior of the ship, and doing the overview with the blueprint, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. If you follow me on Twitter from time to time, I've started sending out screenshots, work in progress, kind of sneak peeks. If that sort of thing interests you, feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.